Shaking Hands and Waving Fists by Fahad al-Khater. Representatives of the colonial governments adopted the Albany Plan during a larger meeting known as the Albany Congress. The British government in London had ordered the colonial governments to meet in 1754 to sign a treaty with the Iroquois that would articulate a clear colonial Indian relations policy for all the colonies to follow. Although the treaty with the Iroquois was the main purpose of the Congress, the delegates also met to discuss intercolonial cooperation on other matters. With the French and Indian War looming, the need for cooperation was urgent, especially for colonies likely to come under attack or invasion. This was the birth of America's diplomatic history. The Treaty of Paris of 1763 ended the French and Indian War between Great Britain and France, as well as their respective allies. In the terms of the treaty, France gave up all its territories in mainland North America, effectively ending any foreign military threat to the British colonies there. Despite what seemed like a success, the Treaty of Paris ultimately encouraged dissension between Anglo-American colonists and the British government because their interests in North America no longer coincided. Differences between the imperial government and colonists on how to levy taxes to pay for debts on wartime expenses, the Treaty of Paris ultimately set the colonists on the path to war-seeking independence. The American Revolution was precipitated in part by a series of laws passed between 1763 and 1775 that regulated trade and taxes. This legislation caused tensions between colonists and imperial officials who made it clear that the British Parliament would not address American complaints that the new laws were onerous. British unwillingness to respond to American demands for change allowed colonists to argue that they were part of an increasingly corrupt and autocratic empire in which their traditional liberties were threatened. This position eventually served as a basis for the Colonial Declaration of Independence. Colonial legislatures sent representatives to Philadelphia, and the First Continental Congress convened in September of 1774. The Continental Congress was a formal means by which the American colonial governments coordinated their resistance to British rule during the first 2 years of the American Revolution. The Congresses balanced the interests of different colonies and also established itself as the official colonial liaison with Great Britain. As the war progressed, the Congress became the effective national government of the country, and as such, conducted diplomacy on behalf of the new United States. In response to the Intolerable Acts, colonial protesters led by a group called the Sons of Liberty issued a call for a boycott. Merchant communities were reluctant to participate in such a boycott unless there were mutually agreed upon terms and a means to enforce the boycott's provisions. Spurred by local pressure groups, colonial legislatures empowered delegates to attend a Continental Congress, which would set terms for a boycott. By issuing the Declaration of Independence adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4, 1776, the 13 American colonies severed their political connections to Great Britain. The Declaration summarized the colonists' motivations for seeking their independence. By declaring themselves an independent nation, the American colonists were able to conclude an official alliance with the governments of France and obtain French assistance in the war against Great Britain. The British government did its best to dismiss the declaration as a trivial document issued by disgruntled colonists. British officials commissioned propagandists to highlight the declaration's flaws and rebut the colonists' complaints. The declaration divided British domestic opposition, as some American sympathizers thought the declaration had gone too far, although in British-ruled Ireland it had many supporters. The declaration's most important diplomatic effect was to allow for official recognition of the United States by friendly foreign governments. The Treaty of Paris was signed by the U.S. and British representatives on September 3, 1783, ending the War of the American Revolution. In October and November of 1782, the United States succeeded in obtaining British acknowledgement of the U.S. independence along with the peaceful withdrawal of British forces. In return for these concessions, the agreement contained provisions requiring the U.S. to honor private debts and ensure an end to the seizure of Loyalist property. U.S. negotiators John Jay, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Henry Lawrence signed a preliminary agreement with British Representative Richard Oswald on November 30, 1782. As the United States spread across the Appalachians, the Mississippi River became increasingly important as a conduit for the produce of America's West. In addition to making military preparations for a conflict in the Mississippi Valley, Jefferson sent James Monroe to join Robert Livingston in France to try to purchase New Orleans and West Florida for as much as $10 million. Failing that, they were to attempt to create a military alliance with England. Meanwhile, the French army in Saint Domingue was being decimated by yellow fever, and war between France and England still threatened. Napoleon decided to give up his plans for Louisiana and offered a surprise Monroe and Livingston the entire territory of Louisiana for $15 million. Although this far exceeded their instructions, they agreed. The colonies of East Florida and West Florida remained loyal to the British during the War for American Independence, but by the Treaty of Paris 1783 they returned to Spanish control. Monroe became president, and John Quincy Adams his Secretary of State. Adams used the Jackson's military action to present Spain with a demand to either control the inhabitants of East Florida or cede it to the United States. Minister Otis and Secretary Adams reached an agreement whereby Spain ceded East Florida to the United States and renounced all claim to West Florida. Under the Otis-Adams Treaty of 1819, also called the Transcontinental Treaty and ratified in 1821, the United States and Spain defined the western limits of the Louisiana Purchase, and Spain surrendered its claims to the Pacific Northwest. In return, the United States recognized Spanish sovereignty over Texas. With the support of President-elect Polk, John Tyler managed to get the joint resolution passed on March 1, 1845 in Congress, and Texas was finally admitted into the United States on December 29. Following the capture of Mexico City in September 1847, Nicholas Trist, chief clerk of the Department of State and Polk's peace emissary, began negotiations for a peace treaty with the Mexican government under terms similar to those pursued by Slidell the previous year. He finally presented Polk with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was signed in Mexico City on February 2, 1848. Under the terms of the treaty, Mexico ceded to the United States approximately 525,000 square miles in exchange for a $15 million lump sum payment, and the assumption by the U.S. government of up to $3.25 million worth of debt owed by Mexico to U.S. citizens. One of the most important victories won by the United States during the Civil War was not ever fought on a battlefield. Rather, it was a series of diplomatic victories that ensured that the Confederacy would fail to achieve diplomatic recognition by even a single foreign government. The Confederate States were incapable of winning enough consecutive victories to convince European governments that they could sustain independence. When the Union did declare a blockade upon the rebel states in April 1861, Britain responded to the blockade with a proclamation of neutrality, which the other European powers followed. This tacitly granted the Confederacy belligerent status, right to contract loans and purchase supplies in neutral nations, and to exercise belligerent rights on the high seas. By officially respecting the Union blockade, even if it was not fully physically effective, Britain maintained a consistent position on belligerent rights. The U.S. reversal of its traditional position stressing neutral rights set the precedent that it would be obligated to respect the British argument in future naval issues. Thank you.